Morning gore, evening grace, brother and sister. Good to have everybody back along with us here with our Temperance Awakening. And welcome to the alcohol lecture that we have here today, just looking at the law in drinking. A lot of what we go over kind of be some of the history of laws and how that's associated with alcohol, and then a couple of things in our present time. So getting right into things here, alcohol laws have been around, almost as long as alcoholic beverages themselves. Even ancient civilizations regulated the sale and public consumption of alcohol, and most governments have since then. And at the same time, the beverage has been an important source of government revenue through taxes or monopolies. And the United States certainly is no exception to this. The first colonists who arrived from England brought with them a set of beliefs about alcohol and how to control its use. And of course, these beliefs have gone through a number of changes over the years, and they've generated a lot of passion and controversy. And so in response, the laws have been changed, on a pretty regular basis at really all levels, federal, state, and local levels. And because the American population and public opinion are constantly changing, alcohol laws are likely to change again and again. And now, looking at the Temperance Movement. And though many of the English colonists who came to America were strict observers of religious laws, they weren't abstainers or non-drinkers. Like even the famous Puritan preacher Increase Mather said, "Drink is in itself a good creature of God, but the abuse of drink is from Satan." The colonists produced and consumed large quantities of beer, whiskey, gin, and rum. And rum was probably the most valuable product manufactured in the colonies. Local governments encouraged the licensing and building of breweries, distilleries, and taverns. And after the United States became independent, the first major threat to its unity was the so-called Whiskey Rebellion of 1794. Thousands of farmers in western Pennsylvania refused to honor a new federal tax on liquor, which they felt threatened their freedom to produce and consume as much whiskey as they chose. And by the early 1800s, Americans were drinking about 3 times as much liquor, beer, and wine as they do today. And alcohol abuse was very common. So in reaction to all this, a temperance movement began to emerge, especially among churchgoers. The movement condemned alcohol abuse as a source of disease and poverty. As alternatives, it promoted temperance. And it encouraged the use of non-alcoholic beverages, such as root beer. And this was an era of a lot of different reformist movements, such as abolitionism, which opposed slavery, prison reform, and women's rights. And many women were active in the temperance movement, which spread throughout the United States and to many European countries. And by the middle of the 1800s, this movement just began to advocate prohibition, a complete ban on the sale of drinking of alcohol, on alcoholic beverages. And Maine became the first state to outlaw alcohol in 1851, and then a lot of other states followed. And then the Prohibition Party was founded in 1869, and the Women's Christian Temperance Union in 1874 signaled the start of a major political campaign. And for the next 60 years, alcohol was one of the most important issues on the political agenda, affecting every presidential election for many decades. The issue split the country into regional, religious, and urban or rural factions. In the early 1900s, the movement gained support from social reformers who wanted to protect the working classes from alcoholism, political reformers who saw alcohol and tavern as a key part of corrupt political machines, and business owners looking to reduce absenteeism and injuries in the factories. And during World War I, which lasted from 1917 to 1918, the government declared wartime prohibition in part to divert grain from alcohol production to food. Then in 1919, the 18th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was ratified, outlawing the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors. And later that year, Congress passed the famous Volstead Act, which put the amendment into effect. And what people called the Great Experiment of Prohibition was underway. The Volstead Act defined intoxicating liquors as any beverage whose alcohol content was 0.5% or more, which made beer and wine as well as hard liquor illegal. But the 18th Amendment didn't make it illegal, though, to possess liquor for personal use, and the Volstead Act did not generally allow searches of individual homes. As a result, many people began to make their own alcoholic beverages. Businesses could legally produce alcohol for industrial and scientific purposes and for sacramental use, like by Catholic priests or Jewish rabbis who use alcohol like in communion. And physicians could also prescribe wine or liquor for medicinal reasons. And all of these loopholes eventually allowed large quantities of legally manufactured alcohol to be sidetracked for sale by what we know as bootleggers. Bootleggers, which are the importers and bulk sellers of illegal alcohol in speakeasies or illegal saloons. The federal government set up a Prohibition Bureau in the Treasury Department to enforce the Volstead Act. Some 170,000 saloons were shut down across the country. Contrary to popular belief, Prohibition was successfully enforced in much of the country, and it did achieve many of its aims. Arrests for public drunkenness declined dramatically. Hospital admissions for alcoholism, alcohol psychosis, and alcohol-related diseases fell by more than half within just a few years. And there were fewer broken homes that were caused by lost wages and domestic violence. And evidence has shown that alcohol consumption fell the most among, working class to poor people who couldn't afford the high price of illegal alcohol. And even after Prohibition was repealed by the 21st Amendment and sales resumed in 1934, consumption did not immediately rise to pre-19 levels, which shows that many people had lost the habit of drinking. And so Prohibition, was successful. Prohibition did do a lot of good. And these tales, I know a lot of people are talking about, I had somebody mention that to me before. They said, did Prohibition, create the mafia, and mobs and, cause a high rise and, mob activity and things of that nature. And that's actually been very, very much exaggerated according to, real recorded history. A lot of these tales of Prohibition crime that have been made popular, in a lot of movies and things, was just that. It was a big exaggeration. Our organized criminal mobs, they ran illegal rackets in big cities, like New York and Chicago and Los Angeles, long before Prohibition. And murder rates had already risen a lot before 1919. The law may have made, millions of ordinary citizens partners in crime, and many immigrant ethnic groups, like Italians, for example. They were, Italians, Irish, Scottish people, maybe even. They refused to give up their cultural attachment to wine, beer, and whiskey. And these drinks also remained an essential part of social life, for middle class and upper class people in bigger cities. And without regulation by the government, much of the alcohol sold was of poor quality, and some was even dangerously toxic. And so we've already kind of, mentioned that, but just looking at fact or fiction, we often do that in these lectures. During the 1920s, when Prohibition was in effect in the United States, people drank more than they ever had before. Some people even say that, Prohibitionists make people drink more. That isn't at all true. It's very much the opposite. Evidence has shown that there was a sizable reduction in drinking during Prohibition. In many states, alcoholic beverages, in most states, alcoholic beverages were not easy to obtain. In all the regions, prices went up, and poor people simply could not afford to drink. But the publicity, though, over Prohibition-related crime and violence began to make the policy unpopular. The publicity that a lot of people for alcohol were putting out. This is calling all this crime, and bootleggers, etc. So when the Great Depression began in 1929, closing factories and throwing millions of people out of work, Prohibition became an economic issue. Opponents held out the hope that repeal would mean new jobs and tax revenues. In 1933, the 21st Amendment to the Constitution was approved, repealing the 18th Amendment. Some states continued Prohibition, though, on a statewide or a local level, because as we said, that did a lot of good. And that's what happens when you have alcohol out of society. In Mississippi, they actually didn't repeal Prohibition until 1966. Like most states adopted new laws to limit the sale of alcohol. They restricted the hours and days that taverns could operate or required taverns to serve food, and some states even banned any sales outside of state-owned, package stores, which never sold by the drink, and many of these laws remain in effect even to today. So now this is a question here. Public intoxication, is that something that's criminal or victim? So after the repeal of Prohibition, state and local governments continued to deal with alcohol abuse, but their focus shifted. Public intoxication and its dangerous effects once again became the main alcohol-related issue in law and government. Public drunkenness laws go back more than 300 years to the first public intoxication statute in England in 1606. In one form or another, these laws always remained on the books in the United States as well. By the early 1960s, police officers in every state were arresting a total of 2 million people a year for the crime of public intoxication. But then public opinion, though, began to change, partly due to the effect of, a lot of groups that were out there to help alcoholics, like Alcoholics Anonymous. A lot of people came to believe that alcoholism should be treated as a disease rather than anything. They wanted intoxicated people, especially homeless people, to be treated with compassion. They wanted to offer them treatment rather than simply arresting them and allowing them to dry out in a jail cell. And despite this public change, the U.S. Supreme Court in 1968 narrowly supported arrest for drunkenness. Partly in response, Congress, though, did pass the Alcoholic Rehabilitation Act of 1968. This law was followed 2 years later by a more comprehensive law that called for major new efforts in research and treatment and set up the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism. Still, another 1970s federal law, the Uniform Alcoholism and Intoxication Act, encouraged states to change their approach as well. The majority of states eventually fell in line, removing simple intoxication from the list of crimes and setting up detoxification and rehabilitation programs. In practice, many public drunks refuse voluntary treatment, and police officers frequently arrest them on public nuisance charges. In any case, alcohol researchers have not yet found new, more effective treatment methods for putting a complete stop to alcohol abuse. In the 1980s, private citizens whose families had suffered from fetal alcohol syndrome and other drinking-related diseases began suing manufacturers and sellers. In response, Congress passed a law requiring health warnings on all alcohol containers. In recent years, dramatic and effective campaigns by groups such as Mothers Against Drunk Driving, like MADD, which is in short, which is called MAD, they convinced states to raise the minimum drinking age to 21. And at the same time, local and state police have worked with judges and juries to strictly enforce drunken driving laws. Following these changes, the rate of fatal alcohol-related car crashes have declined sharply. And then looking at zero tolerance here. During the 1980s, the federal government launched a war on drugs, designed to eliminate the distribution and sale of illegal drugs. It was a response to the alarming increase in drug abuse and addiction, especially among young people. In that climate, zero tolerance became a popular slogan among the public. People wanted the government, school systems, and employers to crack down on any violation of the drug laws. For example, they wanted students to be punished, even suspended from school, if they were found with any amount of drugs on school property. Employers began introducing drug tests for new or current employees. Any trace of drugs in urine would be grounds for dismissal. Over time, the idea spread to other areas of concern, including alcohol. Many states now have zero tolerance for under 21 drivers. They can be prosecuted for even having the smallest, non-zero blood alcohol level while driving. Under pressure from parents concerned about a safe, healthy environment for their children, many school systems have issued zero-tolerance policies against, alcohol, illegal drugs, even tobacco and guns. So, some of these zero-tolerance policies can sometimes seem to be, unfair. Like some parents, can want, schools and so forth to focus on more hard drugs, like cocaine and heroin, rather than a kid, like being caught with alcohol or tobacco in school. But these zero-tolerance policies, though, also protect schools against liability, legal responsibility. Like if the school is sued when a student who drinks on school property is injured, or like a kid, who uses tobacco and they end up with some type of cancer, that administration can show that it made every effort to prevent such events from taking place. This is a tobacco-free, alcohol-free campus. And obviously, this controversy still continues to this day with debates. And so, just like in the end, we endorse health, safety, and public order. And that's what everybody should be for when it comes to these things. And the best way to accomplish that is to abstain from all of it. And so thanks for being with us here for our lecture today. And our next lecture will be looking at something very important, looking at peer pressure and alcohol. Certainly something very important for young people. And so we'll see you then. Once again, thanks for being with us here today. And until the daybreak and the shadows flee away, I am Dr. Cooper, and I love you, and I appreciate you.